This is our first lesson in our study on the introduction to the Bible. I'm Marion Fox teaching the study, this series. We will have a full semester of lessons, two lessons each Thursday night, and we would encourage you to listen carefully to the lessons. Let's give an overview of what we're going to be studying. One of the things in this outline leads into another course that's being taught at this same time, the gist of the Bible. So that will be our last part. We'll get to that in just a moment. Let's look at divisions of the Bible, part 1 and then part 2. This will be our first two lessons. And then we'll look at divisions of the Bible, parts 3 through 11. So we have divisions of the Bible, parts 1 and 2, and divisions of the Bible, parts 3 through 11. This is an overall outline of the materials. And then we'll be looking at languages in which the Bible was written. And then writing materials, because this is important for our study as well, on which the Bible was written. And we'll look at the writers of the Bible, their backgrounds, and give us a better feel for what's going on and how we can interpret the Bible, understand the Bible. We'll also be looking at the time frames, because all of this is critical for understanding the Bible, time frames in which the Bible was written. There were certain Jewish sects that that existed in the first century and in the various time frames of the Bible. Primarily, we'll be looking at those of the first century, not the Old Testament itself. We also have textual criticism. We'll be looking at that, and we'll be studying that. And that'll get somewhat technical, but this will be toward the end of the course. And we'll look at form criticism. We're looking at some other aspects of source criticism, it's called. And we'll be studying that a little bit too. We'll be looking at some early Bible translations, and we'll study them. And various English translations of the Bible, because there are a number of English translations, which gives kind of a history of that study. And then, of course, this would lead us into the gist of the Bible, which is being taught by another one of our instructors, and Chris Hill. And so this would lead right into his course, and this would feed into his course, work well with his. The Old Testament contains 39 books in our present Bible, in the present Bible that we have as it's divided up. But we'll be looking at this, and the New Testament, of course, contains 27 books. 39 plus 27, of course, is 66 books. But the Jews did not divide it up this way. We'll be seeing this in just a moment, the Old Testament, that is. Jesus divided the Old Testament in 3 divisions in Luke 24:44. And we'll see his 3 divisions. And he, that is Jesus, said unto them, These are my words, which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must need be fulfilled, which are written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. So his 3 divisions of the Old Testament. Now, he's divided the Old Testament up. The New Testament didn't exist at this time. And so he divided it up into the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. That's how he divided them up. So he divided into 3 divisions, and that's how the Jews generally divided it at that time. Although we'll see some other ways of dividing it. They don't use exactly these same words. Moses also called the Pentateuch. Now, Pentateuch, Penta is 5, and so it's the 5 books of Moses. We generally call it the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. and that's a term that's used. Use this term because you'll read it in literature, but we just refer to the books of Moses as the Pentateuch. Then Jesus' second division was the prophets, and that would include Joshua and through Kings and Isaiah through Malachi. And then his third division was the Psalms, and this is also called the writings by some people in some portions of the scripture. The writings included the wisdom, what's called the wisdom literature. It would be Song of Solomon, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, and Daniel. That's how they included these books in there. And so their cataloging of that was a little bit different than I would categorize it. The Old Testament contained 39 books, of course, and the Jews divided them up into 22 books. They put them on scrolls, and they had 22 letters in their alphabet. There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And so they would have these scrolls in a container, each one, and they would go Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Aleph, Hey, Vav, and right through the Hebrew alphabet. And that would list the various books by the letters, by a particular letter. And that way they could find them in their library. And Judges and Ruth in the Jewish division were counted as one book, so the two were joined. First and Second Samuel were joined, counted as one book, because of the Hebrew language, it doesn't write. The Hebrew language doesn't have vowels in the written language. Of course, but you have to have vowels to speak words. So their language is very compact. It only writes the consonants. And then the reader has to insert the vowels into it. That causes some problems, as we'll see later. But what we have here is that the Hebrew scroll was for the books of Samuel and the book of Kings, book of Chronicles, was both First and Second Samuel were on one scroll because it was small enough scroll the scribe could hold it while he's reading. But when they translated it with the Septuagint version, which we'll look at later, into the Greek language, the Greek languages has both vowels and consonants in the language, and it virtually doubled the length of the book. So the scrolls were too large, and so they split the book in half. In the book of Samuel, for example, in half into two parts, roughly in the middle of the book. And so we have First and Second Samuel, but originally they were one book. Same thing happened with First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles. So we had three books, one book of Samuel, one of Kings, one of Chronicles, whereas we have six books. We have First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. It's the same material, but it was just split up because the scrolls were just too big and cumbersome for a scribe to hold for very long, be too heavy. So Ezra and Nehemiah were on one scroll, or treated as one book, and were counted as one book. And Jeremiah and Lamentations, of course, Jeremiah wrote Lamentations, but they were counted as one book. So when you start looking at it, you can see where they had the Judges and Ruth. We have two books, they had one. First, Second Samuel, we have two, they had one. First, Second Kings, and so forth. So the number of books would be reduced by putting them together. The 12 minor prophets were counted as one book, and they were put on, I believe, on basically the same scroll. Other books were counted as separate books, and we have a total of 22 books in the Hebrew version of it, how they collected the books. Same material that we have, however. Obviously, as I've already said, there were 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and there are. And the Jews grouped the Old Testament books into 22 books, and they cataloged them by these letters. They're the same as our 39 books, according to Josephus against Appian. in 1:8, and also in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, Book 6, Chapter 25. Now, these two books can be accessed on the internet, and you can find them on the internet. I have both of them in my library, and I have an electronic copy of both of them as well. Here is Josephus, what he says about it. This is a quote from him. Josephus was a contemporary of Jesus, a little bit younger than Jesus, but he lived during that time frame, and he was involved in the war against the Romans that occurred beginning in about AD 66, ending in AD 70, about 3.5 years it lasted. Josephus writes, "For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another, as the Greeks have, but only 22 books." So he claims that the books that were written, the 22 books that we have, are 39 books, that these do not contradict one another. They don't disagree and contradict one another, but they're 22 books, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine, and of them 5 belong to Moses. That would be the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which contain his laws. That would be God's laws and traditions of the origin of mankind till his death. Till the death of Moses, he's talking about there. The interval of time was little short of 3,000 years, but as to the time from the death of Moses till the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, who reigned after Xerxes, the prophets who were after Moses wrote down what was done in those times in 13 books. So we have the 13 books, and that would be your books of the prophets. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. That would be the Song of Solomon, and Proverbs, and Psalms, and Ecclesiastes. That would be those books he's talking about there. But it should be observed, Eusebius writes, now this is Josephus. We get to Eusebius, and Eusebius says, but it should be observed that the collected books as handed down by the Hebrews are 22, according to the number of letters in their alphabet. These 22 books, according to the Hebrews, are as follows. He lists all of the Old Testament books except the minor prophets. And so we don't know why he doesn't list the minor prophets. The law, he lists. Now here's a modern way, as I grew up as a youngster and was taught, we had these divisions. We had the law, that would be Genesis through Deuteronomy, for the Pentateuch. I didn't learn it as the Pentateuch until I was much older. The term Pentateuch was foreign to me. It was unknown to me until I was probably 17 or 18 years old, 16 or 17. And that we listed as law and history, and that would be Joshua through Esther, history. And in the books of poetry, and that would be Job through Song of Solomon, and those books. Then we categorized it as the major prophets, Isaiah through Daniel, and the minor prophets, Hosea through Malachi. Now, the difference between the major and the minor prophets is just the length of their books. And so that's how I learned the 5 divisions of the Old Testament: law, history, poetry, major and minor prophets. Divided differently. I divided law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and history, Joshua, Esther, same as we have Job through Song of Solomon, poetry, so there's no change there. But we get to the next slide and you'll see how I divide the prophets. I divide the prophets up into 3 categories here. There are pre-captivity prophets, captivity prophets, and post-captivity prophets. By dividing them up like this, you get a better feel for them and can put them into their right time frame. And of course, the chronological time frame is critical to understanding the Bible many times. Sometimes it's not critical. There are principles sometimes that are timeless, but sometimes some of the prophets, some of what they're preaching about and trying to get Israel and Judah to return back to God had to have a historical base. So we have the pre-captivity, post-captivity, and post-captivity prophets. And the classifying of prophets into major and minor categories doesn't seem to help us to understand the scriptures. But this classification, I believe, does help us to understand the scriptures. Now let's look at Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, one of the minor prophets. Incidentally, there were half a dozen or maybe more, maybe a dozen or more men in the Old Testament named Zechariah, and even one in the New Testament. So it's a common name. But this is Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, and he lists himself and tells who he is. Zechariah 1:4 says, "Be ye not as your fathers, unto whom the former prophets." So he refers to them as the former prophets cried, saying, "Thus saith Jehovah of hosts, return ye now from your evil ways and from your evil doings." But they did not hear nor hearken unto me, saith the Lord, saith Jehovah, saith Yahweh. Yahweh may be a better translation of the word Jehovah. So right here now, he lists the former prophets, and he, of course, is one of the latter prophets. So in Zechariah 7:7 and 7:12, we have the same classification of the prophets among the former prophets. Of course, that would fit in because he's one of the last of the prophets. Not only should we classify the prophets according to the dates of their work, because this is going to help us be able to interpret them better, more accurately, more precisely, and the people to whom their prophecies were addressed. So we should classify them by the date of their work and the people to whom they're addressed, but we should look about how they communicated. So when we're looking at them, then we need to look at how they communicated. There were two ways they communicated. There were literary prophets. By this, I mean those who wrote books, Isaiah through Malachi, or literary prophets. They wrote the books of Isaiah through Malachi. There are non-literary prophets, Elijah, Elisha, and some others. We learn about these prophets in the historical books. They're mentioned, Elijah is mentioned quite a lot. And so these are non-literary prophets. We have some of the things they taught and said, but we don't have any evidence that they wrote any books, explicit evidence. I think there's a possibility, we'll come back to it in just a minute, that some of these non-literary prophets may have written parts of the scriptures, but we'll come back to that later. Prophets sent to Judah. So let's look at the pre-captivity literary prophets. And that would be, first of all, prophets sent to Judah. That would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, Obadiah, Micah, Nahum, Joel, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. You remember that Israel, because of Rehoboam, Solomon's son's foolishness, Israel was split into two nations. The northern 10 tribes left and formed their own nation. They called it Israel. And the southern 2 tribes remained with, that would be Benjamin, remained with Judah. So those 2 tribes formed the nation called Judah. If you study it more carefully, you'll find that most of the Levites deserted the northern kingdom, which was called Israel, because the northern kingdom from the beginning adopted idolatry. And many of the Levites, a good portion of them left, and if you'll study the history, they left and joined themselves with Judah. So really, there's 3 tribes to a large extent that were forming the nation of Judah. That would be Judah and Benjamin, and then a good portion, probably the majority of the Levites, tribe of Levi. And so it strengthened Judah for a time at least. prophets sent to Judah, it will be your southern kingdom. And the kings of Judah were all descendants of David. And then the kings of the northern kingdom, the best I can tell, the ones I know about were descendants of Ephraim. Now, Ephraim was chosen by Jacob to take his role basically as his firstborn. And so Joseph did not get a tribe, but he got two tribes because Joseph was treated as the firstborn son. He got a double portion of inheritance. So he got two tribes, his two sons. I think he may have had more sons than these two, but those two sons were his two oldest sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh was the oldest, but Ephraim was chosen. And these people seem to think that Manasseh had that right to be a king. Ephraim, had the right to be king by virtue of the promise made to Ephraim and Manasseh by Jacob. The prophets in the second group of prophets were sent to Israel, the northern 10 tribes, and these would look at some non-literary prophets, Elijah and Elisha, and then we have some literary prophets, would be Jonah, Hosea, and Amos. Now, I think it's possible there's some passages that might lead us to believe that Elijah and Elisha maybe wrote parts of the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, some of these books. And so they may have been writing some of those books. Evidence of that to that effect. Some prophet wrote them, and we don't know who it was for sure explicitly, but I think it's possible that these men and some other prophets wrote them. I know some prophet wrote them. History, then, we have the history books, Joshua through 2nd Chronicles. Now, Obadiah was a pre-captivity prophet sent to Judah prior to the captivity. Now, about 700 BC, the northern 10 tribes went into captivity. I'm just giving you round numbers, and about 600 BC, and these are rounded numbers, the southern 2 tribes went into captivity. The northern tribes went into Assyrian captivity. They were very brutal. And the southern 2 tribes went about 120 years later, went into Babylonian captivity. But Obadiah was probably written during the reign of Jehoram. This would be 848 to 844 BC. And so he was during that reign. 2nd Chronicles 21, 8 through 10 and 16 through 17 gives you some historical information relating to the nation of Judah during the time of Obadiah. Now, some would have a question, and it would always bother me when I was younger. Why did God have 2 historical recordings of the nation of Israel? That would be Kings and Chronicles. And the answer is pretty simple when you look at it. The Kings looked at it from the standpoint of the kings, and Chronicles looked at it from the standpoint of the priesthood of the temple, the priest and the temple. And there's a lot of overlap, of course, between these things. Some date Obadiah later at the time of the Babylonian captivity, 586. It's a little hard to date Obadiah. This would make him a contemporary of Jeremiah. And his writings relate to Edom. Now, remember that Edom was the name given to Esau, who was the brother of Jacob. So his nation that came out of him they were cousins to the Jews because Esau and Jacob were twins. They were fraternal twins. And of course, Esau was born first, okay? In 1 Samuel 1:1, Isaiah 1:1, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Now, Isaiah tells us what kings were reigning during his time he was prophesying. And the vision would be probably a series of visions that he saw concerning this. This would be concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of these kings. And this was an extended period of time. So when we're going to understand the book of Isaiah, if we're going to study it, we really need to get into the historical background of what's going on in the kingdom of Israel and in this case, Judah and Jerusalem, the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem primarily. For the background then, what I have here is I have laid out for us. This will help you in your study. We go through 2 Kings chapter 15, verses 1 through chapter 20, verse 21. And then we go to the book of 2 Chronicles 26, chapter 26, verse 1 through 32, 33. This will get us the background of and what's going on during the reigns of these kings. And it should not necessarily be interpreted to mean that we look at Isaiah 1:1, that he began his prophecy at the time of Uzziah's beginning to be king and ended it when Hezekiah died. No, there was an overlapping in here between these. This would be a great length of time because I believe Uzziah and Hezekiah reigned pretty lengthy periods of time. So he just overlapped. Now, I can say this, if this is true, because these kings are listed in order. He was prophesying during part of Uzziah's reign. That would mean all of Jotham and all of Ahaz's reign, and part or even all of Hezekiah's reign. So we find then that he was prophesying a good long period of time. And so I would encourage you to read the background to get the historical background for the prophet so that you can interpret it correctly. Jonah, Amos, Hosea, and Micah were contemporaries of Isaiah. So that being the case, what you need to do is when you're studying these books, and of course these four are what are called minor prophets, but they were prophesying, and so you need to read the 2 Kings 15, 1 through 20, 21, and 2 Chronicles 26, 1 through 32, 33. And that will, again, help you to understand these books. So get your Bible open when you're doing this and read all of these and read these books, historical books, for the background that will help you and give you a better understanding of it. Now let's look at Micah and we can see what my evidence for my point. He said the word of Jehovah, this is Micah 1:1. That came to Micah the Morashite in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So let's back up a little bit. Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Let's back up to Isaiah. It was Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So Isaiah began prophesying before Amos because he was prophesying in the reign of Uzziah and these other three kings. And of course, Micah was only prophesying. I said Amos, but I should have said Micah. Micah was prophesying just a little bit later. He was a little bit younger, I would assume, probably younger, but we don't know for sure. But we know he prophesied during the reign of three of those kings. And that's what he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Now, I put, since he only had those three kings, we need to read the history of Jotham's reign. It begins in 2 Kings 15:32 and 2 Chronicles 27:1. And the end of the reign of Hezekiah is recorded in 2 Kings 20:21 and 2 Chronicles 32:33. So this would be what you'd need to study when you're studying Micah. So because he did not prophesy during the reign of Uzziah. And I'll put my mouse up on Uzziah up here. So, but there's a big overlap between them. A lot of the stuff is covered in the same type of material. Now, we look at this, Micah was a contemporary also of Amos, Isaiah, Jonah, and Hosea. So let's look at Nahum right now. Nahum was a pre-captivity prophet sent to Judah. Nahum was probably written in about 630 BC between the capture of Noaman, Thebes, which occurred in 663 BC, and the fall of Nineveh, which fell in 612 BC. And we get some of this information from the book itself. So we get a time frame when it happened. So we got an outside time boundary. So it was between these two times. So it was between 663 BC and 612 BC. Because we know Nineveh and the fall of Nineveh and the Noaman, which is Thebes in Egypt, is discussed. So we have a time frame. I would put it about in the middle of this time frame, about 630 BC, approximately when it was written. Asa, Ammon, and Josiah reigned during this period. 2 Kings 20, verse 21 through 23:32. And in the book of Chronicles, which you remember deals with the temple and the priest, 2 Chronicles 32:33 through 34:27. So these would be these three kings that reigned during that time. Nahum relates largely to the judgment of Nineveh, judgment upon the nation of Nineveh. So they had already carried the northern 10 tribes into captivity when this occurred, but they're going to be judged because they're pretty brutal and pretty wicked. Some scholars date Joel as early as 900 BC. This would make him the earliest of the literary prophets, except for I argue that Joshua was a prophet, and the writer of the book of Judges, or the writers of the book of Judges, and Samuel were also prophets as well. But we would date Joel, if that's the case, he would be one of the earliest of the writing prophets, literary prophets. Joel directed his prophecies toward all the children of Israel. If he prophesied about 850 BC, he would have prophesied during the reigns of Amaziah and Uzziah, kings of Judah, and Jeroboam, the second king of Israel. This is about the time frame I would date Joel. We would, if that's the case, we would look into those kings and their time frame. Now, Jeremiah was a pre-captivity prophet sent to Judah just before their captivity. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were of Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. So he was a priest to whom the word of Jehovah came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. So he dates the time that he has and gives the time of the 13th year of Josiah, king of Judah. So we need to read about Josiah and what all went on with him. Josiah was the last good king that Judah had, and he was one of the good kings. Now, I'm going to make a sidetrack just for a moment. The good kings in Israel and in Judah, there weren't any good kings in Israel, and the northern 10 tribes. The good kings in Judah, the southern 2 tribes, they drove out the Sodomites, and the bad kings let them back in. And that's one of the things, if you see it. And of course, the good kings drove out the false worship, and the bad kings let it back in. And so there's several things that the good and the bad did that were just opposites. And so one was against these false worships and sodomy and other things being practiced. Continuing in the next verse for Jeremiah 1:3, it came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the king of Josiah, the son of Josiah. So he was not only prophesying in the days of Josiah, but he's also during the time of Jehoiakim, his son, king of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. Now, Zedekiah wasn't a king exactly. He was a governor, and he, of course, had his problems too, and he and Joachim, neither one of them were good kings. Until the carrying away of Jerusalem captive in the 5th month. This is when he prophesied. Now, we're going to see some more about Jeremiah. He was a pre-captivity prophet sent to Judah, but he was right there at the time they went into captivity. He was still prophesying. The historical records of the events occurred while Jeremiah was a prophet are recorded, and I give the references here. In 2 Kings 21:24 through 25:26, 2 Chronicles 33:25 through 36:21. Again, we encourage you to study that material, study these historical accounts to know what's going on in the kingdom. And you'll get a better feel for what's in the book of Jeremiah. He was alive when the captivity occurred. It did not get carried away to Babylon. Now remember, just as a quick synopsis, when they were carried away captivity, the Babylonians came, and Jeremiah told them to go out and surrender to him. The ones who believed Jeremiah went out and surrendered to the Babylonians, were carried away, and they were not made slaves. They were given lands, and they were able to work and had their freedom, pretty much. Then we see they came back again because Judah kept rebelling against the Babylonians. And they made a treaty with them, but they rebelled. They didn't keep their word. And so the Babylonians came back again and forcibly carried some away. So we see this carrying away didn't all happen at one time. And then there was the last one they destroyed the city and carried everybody away except the poor people. And just as a quick side point, God told the poor people, and through Jeremiah said the captivity would be 70 years. And because the land hadn't kept its Sabbaths, and that's a study in itself, because the poor people then were to get every Sabbath year would be able to take the produce of the land. And so God told the poor people who were left there by the Babylonians that they could have the land for 70 years. But they didn't trust Jeremiah. They didn't believe Jeremiah. And because of an Ishmaelite killing the Babylonian governor, they were afraid they were going to be killed. And Jeremiah told them not to go, but they went down into Egypt, and most of them were consumed and disappeared down there in Egypt. And they took Jeremiah with them. And the Jewish historians say that Jeremiah was killed by the Jewish people. But Jeremiah 53 occurred during the captivity, chapter 53 does. Habakkuk was written between 612 and 606 BC when Josiah and Jehoiakim reigned. Habakkuk the prophet, he was a pre-captivity prophet. Assyria fell to the Babylonian and Medo-Persian Empire in 612. It's apparent that Assyria had already fallen when this book was written. So it's after 612. First carrying away into captivity by the Babylonians was in 605 BC. Habakkuk was waiting for the coming of the Chaldeans in Habakkuk 3:16. So he was waiting for it. And so it occurred in 605. So I would date it between 612 and 606 because he hadn't been carried away yet. And so that was a pretty good time frame. You put it in the middle of about 609 BC, probably is approximately when it was written. You just roughly round it off at 610 BC. Be pretty close. Now, the first carrying away, according to 605, Habakkuk was waiting for it. The historical record of the events occurred while Habakkuk was a prophet are recorded in 2 Kings 21 through verse 24 through 25 and verse 26. 2 Chronicles 33 verse 25 through 36:21. So we have that historical background for studying of these books. Now, keep this in mind. This course is designed to give you some foundation for studying. And so what one would do would take this information to study these books. It's just an aid for it to help us to get a good background on how we can see the books and interpret them more accurately or in a correct manner. The book of Zephaniah, don't confuse that with Zechariah, but Zephaniah, or the pre-captivity prophet, also sent. He prophesied during the reign of Josiah. He said in Zephaniah 1:1, the word of Jehovah which came unto Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah. So he's a descendant of King Hezekiah. And this was in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. So he's a cousin to Josiah. He's a descendant of Hezekiah. They're both descendants of Hezekiah. So here, Josiah had one of his cousins prophesying and trying to encourage him and help him. The record of the historical events, of course, is found, and we're just looking at the days of Josiah. And the record of the historical events is found in 2 Kings 21, verse 24 through 23:30, 2 Chronicles 21, verses 1 through 30, 2 Chronicles 35:27. Helpful. Was a pre-captivity prophet sent to the northern 10 tribes, which are now called Israel after the death of Solomon. So we're going to talk about Israel, and when we say this, we're talking about the nation of Israel that had split off from Judah during the days of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Rehoboam was king in Judah. Jeroboam was the one who introduced the calf worship into the northern 10 tribes, which were called Israel at this time. So that's what we're talking about when we say Israel. Jonah probably prophesied about 760 BC. We get this from 2 Kings 14:23 through 29. Now the word of Jehovah, Jonah 1:1, came unto Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, and we see here he's the son of Amittai. In 2 Kings 14:23, we'll skip verse 24. That's what this 3 dots down here means. You're leaving it out. It's called ellipsis. In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria and reigned 41 years. We'd say that in English is 41 years. Which he spake by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet. I say this has to be the same prophet. Okay. So we have it. It was in the days of Amaziah, son of Joash, king of Judah, and Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. And both of these were reigning during this time. And so Jonah was prophesying when both of these have existed. So Jonah was sent to the nation of primary work was with the nation of Assyria. Capital city, of course, is where he went. And he went and preached to it in their capital city. Nineveh being their capital city. Let's look at Hosea. Hosea was a pre-captivity prophet sent to Israel again. The word of Jehovah, which came unto Hosea, son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. So we have him as the time frame, and some of his prophesying overlapped with Isaiah, as I've already told you it did. But I didn't cover him. Whenever you notice that, I skipped him and went to other prophets. And the reason I did is because I've separated him out. He's a pre-captivity prophet sent to Israel, not to Judah. So again, our background material would be almost the same as it would for Isaiah, 2 Kings 15, 1 through 20, 21, and 2 Chronicles 26, 1 through 32, 33. Again, Jonah, Amos, Isaiah, and Micah were contemporaries of Hosea. Of course, Isaiah and Micah were prophesying to the southern tribes, the southern two tribes being called Judah at that time. Amos, to go to the book of Amos now, he's a contemporary of Hosea. The words of Amos, who was among the herdsmen of Tekoa, and so he's from the southern two tribes. So Amos comes in the sin from Judah up to Israel to preach. So he goes from Judah up to Israel. Words of Amos, which was among the herdsmen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. What we know here, it was during the days of Uzziah, so we have to get our time frame here a little bit, and the days of Jeroboam. So we have those two men. This would not be the first Jeroboam, this would be Jeroboam the second. So there were two kings named Jeroboam in the northern 10 tribes. This is the second one. Jonah, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah were contemporaries of Amos. Again, you can tell by what kings were ruling during this time when he was prophesying. Seems when things got the roughest that God had the most prophets out there doing the work and trying to get the people to return back to God. And so we have these prophets working. A lot of their work was, people have the wrong concept of a prophet. They think it's foretelling the future. And they did some of that, but that was just to certify that they were God's prophets, to prove it, to seal them. Whereas most of their work was designed to get the people to repent and come back to God. So Jonah, Micah, Hosea, and Isaiah were contemporaries of Amos. And again, we go by Uzziah, is also called Azariah. Keep that in mind. He has two names, Uzziah and Azariah. 2 Kings 14, 23 through 15, 7, and 2 Chronicles 26, 1 through 26 would be during the time of Uzziah or Azariah, the king. And we see the spiritual state of the nation from the history. And so we see the work of Amos, what he's trying to get across here. But he's speaking primarily to the northern 10 tribes. The historical record should be studied, but it's from these books, and that's found in Joshua through 2 Chronicles. Let me summarize this in my mind. There are two main divisions of the Bible, the Old Testament containing 39 books and New Testament containing 27 books. The Old and New Testaments contain different kinds of literature. The Old Testament was written over a period of about 1,500 years. Job was the first book written, I believe, and he was probably a contemporary, maybe just a little bit before the time of Abraham. And he lived, it appears, around 200 years of age. So he was one of those older patriarchs before the longevity went down to about 70 to 80 years of age. The Old Testament was written over a period of about 1,500 years, and I take Job to be the first book. And in Malachi was the last book. So about 2000 BC would be Job, and about 500 BC, rough figures around the numbers, would be Malachi. This completes our lesson, and hopefully this will be helpful to you.
Hello, you still there?
Yes, I'm still there, Bobby. You got a question?
No, I finally got to you. My other computer is not doing Skype for some reason, so I had to switch right quick, and I missed some. So I'll go back and look at the first.